Thanks for giving me the chance to talk to you a little bit about what grew in Larry's garden. I decided to answer your questions outside because it just seemed like an appropriate place to be. So I'm going to start with your question about questions. I always want the things that I write to invite my readers to wonder and to ask really big and good questions. As you say, kindness, empathy, and compassion are a really important part of this story, but they don't just happen. They don't come about without intention, effort, and courage. Now, the fence is an important symbol in what grew in Larry's garden. It represents fear. The kind of fear that makes us want to keep away from people who are different. And I don't just mean, I'm not talking about dangerous, I just mean unfamiliar. I think there are at least two kinds of fear. There's the sensible caution that keeps us safe, like not getting into cars with strangers or not giving away personal information online, that sort of thing. But there's another kind of fear, and we all have it. It's that anxiety about anyone who seems different. You know, we all have, I think of them in terms of circles. We all have tight little circles that consist of people we know and care about. They're comfortable and familiar, and it's pretty easy to be kind to the people who are inside our circles. But what Larry challenges his students to do is to make the circles bigger, to stretch them, to look further, and to pay attention to people they might not have, or they might have seen but not really noticed before, and certainly didn't take the trouble to get to know. So, what questions do I hope what grew in Larry's garden raises? Well, here's a few. Who am I afraid of, and why? Do I really need to be afraid, or am I just uncomfortable? Is there a safe way that I could reach out to this other person? Maybe it's a new kid in your class. I don't know. Are there people around me that I just haven't been noticing? What are their stories? How could I find out? Is there anyone who is lonely or afraid or sad? How could I make my circle a little bit bigger? Or how could my whole family make our circle bigger? Who could help me? Are there things or people around me that I take for granted? In my home, my family, my neighborhood? And how could I show my thanks? A friend of mine told me a really interesting story. His daughter is in a class, I think it's grade 3 or grade 4, and their school is very close to a senior's residence. And so as a class, they had gone, a nursing home actually, as a class they'd gone to meet some of the seniors who live in this residence, people who don't necessarily get a lot of visits from children. Anyway, then COVID-19 happened, everything had to shut down, and so their class from home decided that they were going to write letters. And so they wrote letters to the elderly people in the nursing home. Some of them they had met once, some of them they hadn't met at all. So it was a little bit scary for some of the children. Maybe some of them didn't have grandparents or didn't have much chance to interact with older people. They weren't necessarily sure what to say or how to write a letter, so they were a little bit fearful. But their teacher guided them and encouraged them to stretch and to try to get over that wall of fear and to reach out to their neighbors. And I think that it made huge difference in the lives of some very lonely and very isolated people who needed to be reminded that they were cared about. You asked me how many drafts went into writing what grew in Larry's garden. Well, probably more than I can even count or remember. I would say dozens upon dozens of drafts. I actually had to go back and check through some of my records to remember, well, I remembered where I first got the idea and how it came to me, but then I needed to remind myself how long it took after that to turn it into a book. And I can tell you that it all started on April 7th, 2017, when I read an article about Larry Zakarko in the Toronto Star. And I really liked the story of the kind of work he did with his students. In fact, it was one of those stories you read about in the morning and think, yeah, that's just going to make me feel good all day. So I shared it on Facebook. And two of my friends came back, well, one was my cousin and a good friend, and they both commented, wow, this would make a great story, you should write this. So I thought, yeah, I think I can do something with that. So that was in the spring of 2017. I started working on it right away. I wrote multiple drafts of the story throughout the summer, and probably by August submitted it to a publisher. And the editor got back to me. She liked it, thought it had the potential to become a good book. But then my work still wasn't done, so the editor wanted the story to be in better shape before she brought it to her colleagues at the publisher. So we worked on it more, and so that meant more and more drafts, more changes, cutting out words, changing words, tweaking the ending. Part of the problem was that I was writing a story that was inspired by a real person and real events, but my story wasn't, it didn't reflect exactly everything that had happened in real life. So we were constantly kind of playing with it and changing it. Like at one point, I thought it was important that the fence be in the story, but then at one point my editor said, you know, maybe it shouldn't be a fence, maybe it should be a company putting up a big condo next door. So I kind of rewrote the story and tried it with that, and then decided, no, I don't like it, it really has to be the fence. So I went and wrote it again. So the story had been through probably dozens of drafts before it even went to the publisher for consideration. And once they said, yes, we like it, we want to turn it into a book, then it had to go through another process of editing, again to pare away unnecessary words, to make it a little bit shorter, a little bit tighter. And that's a lot of work, it takes a lot of time. So, like I say, from getting the idea in spring of 2017, it was a full 3 years before I could actually hold that book in my hands. And Julie, you mentioned perfectionism. I'm definitely a perfectionist, and I have learned something. I've learned that there is a space, or there's room for being a perfectionist when you're a writer, but you got to confine it to the right time. And at the start of the process is not the right time. You have to be prepared to make a mess, to take a risk, to take a chance, to play and write and rewrite, yeah, and to fail. Like, you have to be prepared to try and have it not work and say, okay, I'm going to throw that out and start again. And it's then when you get the story to the point where it's almost ready, that's when the perfectionist part can start to kick in, and you can play around with individual words. And I went and talked to, actually I'm going to show you something here. This is my writing book, and I have nice neat little notes here. I said, what grew in Larry Zakarko's backyard? And my notes started nice and neat here. And then when I actually started to work on the story, you can see it's getting a lot messier. And then it starts looking like this after a while. I went and talked to a group of students one time at a school, and they made me a thank you card afterward. And one of the best things someone said to me, one of the boys in the class wrote, "Thank you for letting us know that writing is messy." And I thought, yeah, writing is messy, but that's okay. Sometimes you have to make a big mess to be creative. Of course, you can't leave it as a mess, but keep the perfectionism for the end of the process, not the start. What was my favorite picture book as a child? I didn't actually own a whole lot of picture books when I was little, but we had what was called the bookmobile, which was basically a library on a bus that came around to our neighborhood once a week. So I used to go and load up on books. And one that I really remember from when I was little was called, it was either Keep Your Mouth Closed, Dear, or Keep Your Mouth Shut, Dear. I forget which, by Alary. And it was about this little alligator who swallowed things accidentally every time she opened her mouth. And I don't even know why I liked it so much. It was silly and funny and totally impossible. Because she wasn't just swallowing food, she would swallow wooden spoons or the vacuum cleaner. And obviously this became quite a problem in her household, and so her parents were trying to train her not to open her mouth, and there was probably some underlying message there about self-control that, anyway, I just thought the book was funny and I loved it and I wanted it read over and over again. This is a book I loved as a kid too, and I still have a copy. All the Frances books, Frances the Badger. This one is a baby sister for Frances, and I never had any siblings myself, so I don't know why I loved this one so much, but she gets jealous of her baby sister and runs away. But for Frances, running away means running to the living room and hiding behind a chair. So that was about as daring as I got too, and I used to pack a little suitcase, and I would take my mom's, these little clips that she used when she did her hair, and I would attach them to my fingernails so they looked like badger claws, and I would just become Frances. And there's something very very gentle and very calming about these books, I think. And when I read them as an adult, I'm kind of surprised by how much text there is in them. There's a lot more words than in some picture books today. Anyway, I love the Frances books. Another one that I just want to mention because my connection with it has changed a lot over the years is Frederick by Leo Leone. Frederick the Mouse is, well, he's an artist, I guess you'd say, an artist and a poet. And he comes into conflict with his family because winter is coming and the mice are all outside getting ready. They're working to make sure that they have the food and the supplies that they need to get them through the long winter. But they're not quite sure what Frederick is contributing because he seems to just be sitting there in the sun not doing anything. And what he says he's doing is he's gathering sunlight because the winter is dark. He's gathering colors because the winter is bleak and gray. He's gathering words because they're going to run out of things to say. And sure enough, in the dark and cold and boredom of winter, Frederick is the one who speaks to them of sunlight and warmth and spring flowers and the power of his words, and the pictures that he paints for them help them through this difficult time. So as a kid, I think I just loved this idea of Frederick being able to offer this gift from his mind and his imagination. I think when I became an adult, I went through a phase where I got kind of irritated with Frederick, and I thought, come on, Frederick, you know, you can still collect seeds and collect colors at the same time, but pull your weight, man. But there's still something very lovely and endearing about this book. And just one more. It's not actually a picture book, but it was a lifetime favorite of mine, and you can see that the poor thing's actually falling apart. This was a birthday present to me from a friend. It's called Italian Fairy Tales. And I loved it. It does have pictures in it, so it's really more of an illustrated storybook. There's a giant disappearing down a well. But it was kind of other than the Arabian Nights, it was my first encounter with fairy tales outside the usual range of Cinderella and so on. And I didn't really know why I loved these fairy tales so much. But then when I came to be an adult and I went back to them and started reading them to my own kids, I noticed that a lot of the female characters are very, very active. They don't just sort of sit in a tower and wait to be rescued. They actively participate in saving themselves, which is kind of cool. And I also discovered that some of the stories, some of those Italian fairy tales showed up in this collection of tales from classical Persia. So that was kind of a neat insight for me in seeing how these very ancient stories pass from one part of the world to another. So yeah, a few of my favorites, and I hope you have lots of favorites too. And who knows, maybe what grew in Larry's garden will be one of them.